Welcome, everyone. I am Takatoshi Ito, Director of the Program on Public Pension and Sovereign Funds at the Center on Japanese Economy and Business, or CJEB, at Columbia Business School. I'm also a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs, or SIPA, at Columbia University. We are delighted that you've joined us for this US-Japan political relationship under the new leaders. And before we start, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's organizers, Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo and CJEB at Columbia University. For those who don't know, the CJEB was established in 1986. And the center's mission is to promote knowledge and understanding of Japan's economy and its business systems in an international context. CJEB is the only research center focusing on Japanese economy and its business systems within the university setting in North America. So that makes the center at Columbia very special. I want to take a moment to thank CJEB's corporate and individual sponsors for their generous donations, which allows to continue developing and delivering exceptional programming like this. Today's discussion is focused on the US-Japan political relation and under the Trump and Ishiba administrations. We will consider questions including will President Trump demand higher defense spending by Japan? How will Japan respond? And so on. And I would like to introduce our panelists. So we are very much honored to be joined by three experts on US-Japan relations. Gerald Curtis is a Burgess Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Columbia University, and also chairman of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, and Distinguished Research Fellow at Tokyo Foundation for Political Research. Mireya Solís is a Philip Knight Chair in Japanese Studies and Director and Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Center for Asian Policy Study of the Brookings Institution. Kazuto Suzuki is a professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo and director of the Institute of Geoeconomics. Okay, so today's event will be open discussion among these speakers, and we are accepting audience questions. So please submit any questions you have via Q&A function in Zoom. And you can also use interpretation function to select the English or Japanese language channel. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce my fellow moderator, Takeo Hoshi, Director of Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo. Takeo?
Thank you, Taka. I assume many of the audience today was at the last week's panel on US-Japan economic relations, but let me once again say a few words on Tokyo College. Tokyo College was created within the University of Tokyo 6 years ago with the purpose of generating new knowledge to contribute to the creation of an inclusive society and sparking deeper public engagement. Under the slogan, "Shaping a Shared Future Together," we have been inviting distinguished scholars and intellectuals from all over the world, but especially from the US and Japan, and featuring them as speakers in webinars like this on important topics today. And part of our activities, including these webinars, are supported by generous donations. So I echo Taka's remark in thanking our supporters. And I hope you find our webinars valuable and useful, and hope you can continue supporting us. With that, I hand it back to Taka.
Yes, thank you, Takeo. So let's dive in immediately to questions. Okay, my first question is, what is your first impression of President Trump's foreign policy initiatives in the first 30 days? Any surprises? Any concerns? And particularly any concerns by Japanese? And please keep it brief, and we'll do it point by point discussion later. So I'd like to start with Jerry. So Jerry.
Well, I'm delighted to join this this webinar. The timing could hardly be more propitious. It's we've had a month of Trump and a lot has happened. So, I think the most important point about this first month of Trump is that we're at a moment in U.S. politics and foreign policy that's unprecedented since the end of the Second World War, 80 years ago. Trump has shown he's determined to ignore generally understood guardrails limiting presidential power. He's purging the bureaucracy without mercy, using emails to summarily dismiss thousands of people and have them vacate their office immediately. He's dismantled USAID, and he has his sights set on doing the same to the Department of Education and other federal agencies. And as you know, the Republicans who control the majority of both houses of the Congress either support his policies or they're too afraid to criticize them and incur the president's wrath and the all too real possibility of being ousted in a primary when the next election comes around. I'm impressed. I'm impressed by how much Trump's combination of isolationism, protectionism, and new imperialism, seeking to buy Greenland, recover control of the Panama Canal, taking control of Gaza, forced Palestinians to live elsewhere, make Canada the 31st state. All of these actions and many others are shredding the international institutions and procedures that have defined the rules-based international order. I'm also impressed by how popular many of his policies are with the American public, and by how much his foreign policy is forcing other countries, especially Europe right now, to face the reality that they have no choice but to respond to a fundamental reordering of the U.S. role in the world that Trump is bringing about. So far, this has not directly impacted on U.S.-Japan relations, but as I'll come back and talk about later in our conversation, it will. Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference last week gave an incredibly insulting and hostile speech, attacking European allies for not welcoming extremist parties into their government, for not spending a lot more on defense, and basically warning them, don't count on us. So there's a true sense of crisis in Europe about how to respond to Trump. And it's questionable whether NATO can survive, given Trump's hostility. Trump's fantasy of building a Riviera in Gaza after driving the Palestinians who lived there to go elsewhere as a project of ethnic cleansing that has been universally condemned, but it has forced Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others in the region to try to come up with an alternative plan. As I said, so far this transformation of the geopolitical landscape has not impacted U.S. relations in Japan, but it's only a matter of time before it does. So Japan needs to think about it and get ready. Trump's popularity hit a high of 53% in the most recent CBS TV poll. That's higher than it ever was when he was president the first time. But, it's quite possible that it will decline if there's a backlash among voters caused by higher inflation, cutbacks in government programs. It's worth remembering that Biden's popularity in the first months he was president was also exactly the same, 53%. 6 months later, it fell to less than 50%, and he never recovered majority support. But this is the main point I want to make. Even if criticism of Trump grows stronger, even if the Democrats are able to regain a majority in the House of Representatives 2 years from now, the consequences of Trump's radical policies, both at home and abroad, are going to be profound and long-lasting. And Japanese, like everyone else, has to come to grips with this reality. Why don't I stop there, and then I'll come back in after we hear some from others.
Thank you, Jerry. It's not a very pretty picture, but we'll go from there. Next is Mireya. Mireya?
Yes, thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation to be with all of you for this webinar. And we indeed have very serious matters to discuss. I very much share the views that Jerry just expressed. So let me just add a little bit, put some emphasis on many of the concerns and I would say surprises that we've seen in just 1 month. And to think that we're just getting started, it's another element here. So, if I was to think about what are things that I was not expecting and I think are of great consequence, for example, I would mention the early focus on the Western Hemisphere and the fact that the Trump administration has done quite a bit to strain relations with neighbors. And also that he has used frames like, in the inauguration speech, there was a reference to manifest destiny, which many of you may know is something that was used in the past to justify U.S. expansionism. So this idea that, there's been a drumbeat about territorial expansion, I think it's something that is very concerning. Then take into account that the first trip that Secretary of State Rubio took outside of the country was to Panama, where the Trump administration has been pressuring the Panamanian government and has hinted that they're not happy with Chinese influence there. I don't think they have a very solid case to make, but nevertheless, they're making the point that the U.S. may consider enforcing its treaty rights. Again, it creates a lot of concern among Panamanians. And the use of tariff threats against Colombia and against Mexico and Canada. Again, I think this idea that the U.S. is throwing its weight around in its neighborhood, I don't think it's smart diplomacy. Going with this theme of how the U.S. is losing stature and influence, another shock was the decision to suspend foreign aid programs and to basically shut down USAID. I think that there's a lot of cruelty in these actions because this is much needed humanitarian assistance and a lot of people are experiencing immediate harm. But I also think that it's very short-sighted because in the long term, this clearly erodes U.S. influence and where the U.S. is deliberately ceding influence to China with these actions. Then I know that you had a discussion last week on the economic side, but I think it's also important to note that, Tariff Man is back, but he's also unrestrained. And so he's announcing, I think, measures that are going to have a more disruptive effect. And as I mentioned before, the use of tariff threats vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico that would basically undo, the credibility of the USMCA, this free trade agreement, but also this idea that now the administration is studying about reciprocal tariffs that I think could undermine some of the key tenets of the global trading system, which are about non-discrimination. And I would end my initial intervention, Taka, just with the following observation. The sheer speed at which this is all happening. I have one more point to add that, I was not thinking about it as much as I'm thinking now. From the beginning of the week to now, so many things are happening. And, we all expected for Trump to take a very hard line vis-a-vis European allies and that he had a strong interest in negotiating with Putin and that he may actually undermine Ukraine in doing so. But the speed at which this has come to pass and, how he has even said that Ukraine is responsible for the war and has sought to undermine President Zelensky. This is happening at a very, very fast clip. And I think with very profound consequences, just as Jerry mentioned. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mireya. And Kazuto is next. Kazuto?
Right. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very happy to be joining this panel. I'm very honored to be one of the Japanese representatives in this cohort. I think there are a lot of surprises, but I think at the same time, it's not so surprising because we have experienced in the first Trump administration, and we know that there are a certain kind of Trump's patterns of behavior, like taking everything into a bargain and to make the everything in the bilateral context instead of the multilateral context. I think the second Trump 2.0 is more than the it's a hyper powerful Trump 1.1 1.0, but I think there are certain elements of surprise. One thing is about I think both Jerry and Mireya mentioned about the imperial expansion. This is more like a United States back in the 19th century to be more isolationist and protectionist, using the high tariff to protect its own industry. But at the same time, I think the way in which that Trump uses the tariff as the leverage to other countries is more like the United States in 1980s, when there were certain trade friction between Japan and United States, and this sort of an idea of getting back to the using the American power as the leverage to coerce other countries to change their policy courses. So I think the Trump administration is cutting across the 3 centuries in imperialist expansion in 19th century and the trade friction or the using the American power to leverage against other country in 20th century. And also, living in the 21st century, the Trump is taking the technological competition more seriously. So I think 19th, 20th, and the 21st century are all existing in the one framework, and that's how I characterize the Trump's foreign policy. For Japanese concern, I think is the biggest concern is the tariff, and so far the Japan-U.S. summit 2 weeks ago, Mr. Trump has not mentioned tariff explicitly against Japan, but he is going to impose the 25% on tariff on automobile from April. So this will have a significant impact on the Japanese export, and I think this would not make much sense for in terms of the economic policy, which eventually introducing more inflationary pressure. And also, I think it doesn't make sense for the security policy because of the its contradiction to its alliance policy. So I think the Mr. Trump policy seems to be very much of the abandoning the U.S. leadership, and I think in the USAID case, abandoning all this international aid also creates a situation where the United States is losing its soft power as the global leader. And I think this is one of the concerns, because most of the the Japanese foreign policy and the security policy, or initially, or it's the U.S. leadership is a foundation of the Japanese foreign policy and the security policy. So I think this would put the Japanese foreign and security policy into a different dimension, and to reconsider the issue with regard to China or the North Korea in a very different perspective. So I think this is one of the biggest concerns. Finally, I have one more thing to add, is about the U.S. Steel, Nippon Steel case. The Nippon Steel's decision was made during the Biden administration, but Trump administration still continues to follow the Biden's decision. And although there were certain new idea of blocking the acquisition, but accepting the minority investment, which does not necessarily make economic sense for the Nippon Steel. But I think this sort of approach creates more concern for Japan to face the tariff policy as well as the investment policy. And I think this is the biggest concern for Japan.
Thank you, Kazuto. So let's move into specifically the U.S.-Japan relationship. And Prime Minister Ishiba flew into Washington and met Mr. Trump. And Japanese media seems to be rather warm in interpreting how it went. And he was the second leader to meet Trump, and the meeting seems to have gone smoothly, and but was it really a success? And they didn't solve anything, right? And but they just became friends. So what's your take on this? Let's start with Mireya.
Thank you. I think it really depends on what are your expectations about the one meeting and what it can accomplish. And I think that my sense is that the Japanese side was obviously preparing very, very carefully the idea that the meeting could go badly and that there could be a surprise, or that Trump could attack Japan for trade deficits or not making contributions to defense spending. I think that, with someone as unpredictable as Trump, I think that's how many are preparing for those first meetings. I also think that there was a lot of attention on how the leaders, the chemistry would be. And it has always seemed to me that that's not the right way to think about it, because what Prime Minister Abe and President Trump had, it's something that cannot be replicated. You cannot program chemistry. And I think that President Trump is not the same as he was when he had that first meeting in Trump Tower with Abe, when he had not experienced yet being in charge of government, and therefore I think he was more open to receiving some advice from Abe. So I think that for Ishiba, always the comparison with the connection that Abe and Trump had was creating some difficulties. And I thought it was interesting that Prime Minister Ishiba prepared so thoroughly. What we hear is that there were tons of briefings and obviously no golf lessons. That's not how he was going to approach this. And I also thought it was interesting that this was carefully choreographed and kept short. So you did not want the leaders to have too much unstructured time because I think you're concerned that something can go off the program. So having given you all these caveats, I think that the expectations were, we want to have a meeting that there has an element of normality to it. I think that it was clear that from the point of view of Japan, some of the things that they wanted to get, they got. And that is a statement that the United States is committed to the defense of Japan, so that security guarantee is provided. I think it was also seen as positive the fact that there was no direct pressure at the moment on Japan, no direct trade bashing, or calling Japan a free rider during the meetings. On the contrary, if you look at the interactions, I think that they were very warm. I think that Trump clearly seemed to enjoy the company of Ishiba, even though they had a very short time together. And, I thought it was very interesting that the leader statement is a completely normal statement, in the sense that this is a statement that could have been written by Republican or Democratic administrations and their Japanese counterparts from going back many years. So, when you have so much redefinition of what the U.S. is doing in the world, holding on to these level of normality, I think it's something that was welcomed. Now, I think that there was some art to how the Japanese side approached this, and they understand what Trump relates to. And one way to deflect the trade pressure was to play up Japan's contributions as, one of the largest, or if not the largest investor in the United States. I thought it was interesting that they know that Trump likes simple figures, and, talking about that investment crossing a new milestone of $1 trillion. I think that's something that Trump could relate to. So, for the purposes of the first meeting and not creating a lot of uncertainty as to where U.S.-Japan relations are heading, I think that meeting is successful. The question, of course, is what happens after the meeting. And, there are some things that are, as we've been saying, pretty fundamental and are going to pose difficult challenges and choices for Japan going forward. One is that in that statement, you cannot have language saying that there's a commitment to the rules-based order. But the language that the Trump administration favors is peace through strength. And, the peace goal is very good, but the problem is that the Trump administration is thinking of the assertion of power and the way in which you now focus, diplomacy or how you move around in the international stage. But also, even on the trade deficit, there was a lot about now a commitment that the two sides will work to reduce the trade deficit. That's going to be difficult to do, even if Japan buys more LNG gas, or, if there's more investment from Japanese companies, that frequently also generates, more trade in components and inputs, and that can also put pressure on the trade deficit. So I would say, it was successful for the first meeting with these low expectations, but that does not take away from the fact that, the United States under Trump has a very different set of parameters of how it's deploying its foreign policy. And that's also something that Japan is going to have to navigate, very, very soon.
Thank you, Mireya. And let's move on to Kazuto. And what's your take on this summit meeting?
Right. I think Mireya has thoroughly explained what happened, so I think there's not much to add. But I think one of the interesting part is that the opening meeting was supposed to be 30 minutes, but among the 30 minutes, the 20 minutes was on camera. So that was, I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but it seems that it gives a certain level of openness and the transparency, which made it possible for the Mr. Trump not to make a sort of a strange expressions or statements in that regard. And I think there were much less. It was a very interesting presentation of the cordiality between Mr. Trump and Mr. Ishiba. Also, I think this was a very normal meeting. It is reassuring the all the security engagement on the Senkaku and the North Korean denuclearization, the Taiwan Strait, the stability in the Taiwan Straits. But it seems that it's all written in the communique. But I don't think that Mr. Trump has read it all, and I think they are not much of strong commitment on these papers. So we shall not be. We accept this that there was an intent both on the Japan and the United States to maintain this meeting as normal as possible, but that doesn't mean that these agreement and commitment was secured. So as Mireya said, I think what happens next is going to be a very important, and probably, for example, in case of North Korea, Mr. Trump has more very strong interest in negotiating with Kim Jong-un, and whether this would lead to the acceptance of the North Korea as a nuclear state, or or the issue with China on Taiwan Taiwan. I don't know if the Mr. Trump's commitment to the Taiwan Strait, especially given the fact that the Department of State website has withdrawn the concept of the supporting the independence. So I think these are the kind of things that that may disrupt the agreement. So I think the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs were fully aware that these are just the words and not really a serious commitment. And probably, I think what Japanese government will do is to make sure that these are the documents that is signed on the both sides, so that we keep demanding this as a reference of the bilateral and issues with regard to the bilateral relationship.
Great, thank you. Jerry?
So, I mean, both speakers have made the point. The bar was very low for success, and so it was successful. It was a courtesy call. The fact that I think this is the first time ever that the bilateral summit between the U.S. president and the Japanese prime minister was conducted almost entirely in front of the press. Kazuto made the point. 30-minute meeting, 20 minutes was open to the press, which means that there was no confidential conversation about anything, which is, well, it's really extraordinary. The joint statement, which I'm sure Trump didn't know anything about and couldn't care less, except for a couple of points in it that the Americans wanted about combating international travel by illegal immigrants and unleashing the United States affordable and reliable energy and natural resources. If you leave that out, I mean, except for those two things, no mention, as Mireya already indicated, no mention about a rules-based international order, free trade, multilateralism. This could have as easily come out of the Biden White House as out of the Trump White House, and that is a victory of sorts for the Japanese Foreign Ministry and U.S. State Department bureaucrats who wrote this. This, Trump's only been in for a month. He didn't have time, and I'm sure the NSC and so on, they didn't spend a lot of time worrying about this. This was not an important meeting, except for Ishiba. It was really important for Ishiba because somehow he went home, and everybody heaved a sigh of relief that he got into Washington, met with Trump, and got back, and there was no problem. And so it's a success. I'm not critical of Ishiba for the way he handled the meeting. He did what he had to do. But I'm very disappointed with the Japanese media and with Japanese pundits who could do no more except see this meeting through the narrowest bilateral U.S.-Japan lens. U.S.-Japan relations is in a global context. Well, think about what's going on in the rest of the world and how it might affect Japan, and the fact that Ishiba did not discuss it, that Trump did not discuss it, that should be a problem that people talk about. It's really a responsibility of the media and of intellectuals to try to alert the Japanese public to the fact that we are in the biggest change in the international system since the end of the Second World War. You can't just say, wow, Ishiba went and shook hands with Trump and they liked each other, and he came home and now we can breathe a sigh of relief. No, can't breathe a sigh of relief. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question. So I didn't watch the 30-minute press conference or the meeting and the press conference intensely, but I've noticed when the President Trump gave some memorabilia of pictures with two leaders framed, and President Trump wrote something on the left-hand side, and it said, "Dear Prime Minister." It didn't say, "Dear Shigeru." And ever since, Nakasone, Ron and Yasu, and the first name basis relationship is a very important concept for the incoming prime minister. And from that point of view, I think Ishiba failed to establish the first name basis relationship. But do you have any? You watched all those press conferences and so on. Did ever President Trump call him Shigeru?
Not that I'm aware of.
I'm not aware either, but we should also remember that President Trump, although he had I think a very genuine connection to Prime Minister Abe, even at the meeting with Prime Minister Shiba, called him Agi, right? He wouldn't even pronounce his last name correctly. So that's a standard we should use, that he doesn't remember those names very well.
And I think also, after meeting with Ishiba, he met with Narendra Modi, and he gave also a similar memorabilia, which says, "Dear Prime Minister." So, Trump knew Modi a long time before. I mean, he was a prime minister during the first Trump administration, but still he calls him prime minister. So I think this is just a gaffe, and it's not really important.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'm worrying too much. Okay, so let's go to the what Jerry pointed out and others pointed out, the coming threat, not at the leaders' meeting, but we expect what's coming. And one of them is defense spending. And President Trump is complaining about NATO and complaining about Europeans, but he hasn't mentioned yet Japan and South Korea. So do you think that this demand on increased spending, maybe up to 5% of GDP, those demands would come to Japan and South Korea once his attention comes to East Asia? So let's start this question from Kazuto, please.
Right. I think during the joint press conference, Mr. Trump has mentioned that there was a recognition of Japan committed to double its defense spending by 2027, and he was not complaining about it as it is small. And I think Mr. Ishiba has during the meeting he mentioned during the meeting he mentioned the reasons and the limits that Japan can afford to for the defense spending. So it seems that at this moment, Mr. Trump understands the importance and the necessity that Japan is facing, and I think there is a general understanding. But nevertheless, I think the recognition by Mr. Trump was coming from the text that is prepared for the joint statement. So I think it's not, I don't think Mr. Trump genuinely accepts the Japanese position. So in the future, maybe there are possibility that he might demand further spending. And I think largely because of this idea of abandoning the American leadership and giving, to putting more effort by the allies. I think for mentioning Taka mentioned about South Korea, I think South Korea is going to be in a much more tougher situation, probably partially because of the Trump's intent to negotiate with North Korea, and probably in that regard, the presence of the American forces in the Korean Peninsula will be decreased. And in response to that, the South Korea has to increase its defense spending. Meanwhile, I think the U.S. forces in Japan will remain as a key strategic deployment, forward deployment. So I think it's going to be more demand for Japan to support as a host nation support. So probably it will come, but not at this moment.
Thank you. Jerry?
So, well, the pressure on America's allies to spend a lot more than they're spending now is going to be very intense, especially on NATO countries. The point has already been made, but Japan will make the case, and I think probably successfully, that it's on track to reach 2% of GDP spending by 2027, that it's upgrading its defense capabilities, increasing the interoperability with American forces. So I think there'll be some difficult negotiations over defense spending and probably over host nation support. But, with skillful diplomacy by the Japanese foreign ministry, I think Japan is probably going to be able to avoid a major confrontation with the U.S. over defense spending. And as far as Trump goes, his focus, I suspect, will be much more on tariffs and Japanese investment in the U.S. than on these defense issues when it comes with Japan, unlike the situation with NATO countries. But there's a point I want to stress. How much more Japan should spend on defense in response to Trump's demands is essentially a tactical issue. The more important question for Japan is how to come to grips with the strategic challenge of adjusting Japanese policy to respond to a dramatically changed geopolitical environment that Japan and the world now face. Japanese leaders, Americans too, often refer to the US and Japan as having a strategic alliance. But a strategic alliance presumes a commonality in the strategies of the two countries. The reality, however, is that American and Japanese strategies are in several important respects no longer aligned. Japan says its strategy is to sustain a rules-based international order. Trump has made it painfully evident he rejects the rules-based international order as disadvantageous for the US and is determined to replace it with an American-first strategy. Japan is a leading advocate of multilateral free trade agreements. Trump is out to extricate the US from all of those agreements. Japan has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, and Prime Minister Kishida went so far as to warn that today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's Asia. But Trump accuses Ukraine of starting the war, calls Zelensky a dictator, is shifted his focus away from dealing with the Europeans to dealing with the Russians and trying to do an end run around Europe and Ukraine to get an agreement, and making concessions already before the negotiations begin to Russia on what a peace settlement should look like. And finally, there's a lot of uncertainty with regard to how US and Japanese strategies towards China will evolve in both countries. It's impossible to know whether those strategies will align or whether they will diverge, whether Japan will seek accommodation with China while the US pursues a hardline policy, or whether conversely, Trump will cut a deal with China without taking Japanese interests into account. These are really fundamental questions that have to be faced in a way that has not been done for the past 50, 60, 70 years. Japan has few strategic options, but it cannot just bury its head in the sand, placate Trump, and wait for politics in the US to become more normal. Whatever normal means in the future, it's going to be a new normal. So I think, probably Japan has to try to find a way to strengthen the alliance and hedge against the dependence on the US at the same time. And that probably means taking a more leadership role in Southeast Asia and in dealing with the global South and relations with India and with Europe. in short, the challenge that I think Japan faces is how do you keep relations stable with a U.S. administration that is determined to transform the international system in the most radical way, while at the same time being able to pursue national interests that don't align with Trump's preferences. That's a very difficult circle to square. You want to have a good relationship with the U.S., but you don't want to be sort of made hostage to Trump's policies. So we're living in a very dangerous time. It's a dangerous world. And it's not good enough for the Japanese Prime Minister to go to Washington and have a cup of tea with the president and talk in front of the press about how wonderful the relationship is. We're past that. This is not the time for that kind of behavior, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. We're going to talk about China in the next round of discussions. But before that, Mireya, do you have anything to add on defense spending?
Thank you. Just very briefly, because Kazuto and Jerry covered this so well, and I think that Jerry raised really fundamental challenges going forward. I would note that one more area where I see divergence between the United States and Japan, picking from Jerry, is, an engagement with the developing world, with the global South, and the use of economic tools, not only trade liberalization, trade integration, but economic assistance, development assistance, and this speaks to the freezing of U.S. aid, but also the fact that the U.S. Decided not to attend the I have so many university titles in front of me, the G20 meeting that Rubio is skipping, right? So I think that again, it runs counter to so much of what Japanese diplomacy has been over the decades, and certainly more recently when there has been a push on how we engage with the global South, especially in the aftermath of Russia's aggression of Ukraine, where it was clear that there was a gap there and a need to address it. Just quickly on the defense side, I would only add, I think that all the points have been made. I would just only add that, yes, the strategic environment around Japan is deteriorating, and that puts a premium on how Japan is going to think about its strategy, think about its defense capabilities. But that also is happening at a time when the domestic politics are going to make this more challenging in Japan. And, when Prime Minister Kishida lifted that informal 1% ceiling on defense expenditures, he basically kicked the can down the road. And how are we going to pay for it? Would that require tariff increase, tax increases or not? And I think that now that Prime Minister Kishida has a minority government and he must negotiate with opposition parties, that becomes even a more pointed question. So it's what happening in the domestic sphere, and also what's happening around Japan.
Thank you, Mireya. So I'd like to turn the discussions to U.S.-China relationship and its spillovers to Japan. And actually, we can think of two very different scenarios about U.S. and China. One is that there'll be a hostile exchange in terms of tariff and other issues. That's one scenario. Another scenario is actually, this is a question from the audience, that what about the risk Trump will cut the deal with Xi Jinping over Taiwan, as he apparently is doing with Putin over Ukraine? And this audience wants to know Jerry's thinking about this possibility. So let's start with Mireya and go to Jerry and Kazuto on this U.S.-China relationship and spill over to Japan. Mireya?
Sure, I'll get us started. I think that in the long term, the U.S.-China relation will remain defined as one of competition. I think that trade friction is going to be there. I don't think that it's going to be easy to address, the market access, the intellectual property, the state capitalism issues that the overcapacity practices of China. I also think that technology race is going to continue, and I do think that China is very determined to try to leapfrog in these technologies, and the United States will try to keep as much distance. And I think therefore that will continue to define this relationship as one of competition. And I also believe that China's push to try to dominate the Indo-Pacific at the expense of U.S. influence in the region will make these a competitive relationship. That's the long term. In the short term, medium term, I think that we're going to see under this American president push for some kind of negotiation. I think that Trump believes that he is the ultimate deal maker. And we saw a little bit of that dynamic in the first term, that he tried to strike a deal with China. That didn't go very, very well, because China never really fulfilled its promises under that first stage trade agreement. But I think that that's an instinct that Trump has. And I think that the business instinct that he has and the bragging rights that he would get from getting a deal with Xi, and I'm sure that there'll be he would love to go to Beijing, and I think that explains also why Xi got an invitation to come to the inauguration, and that did not happen. Now, it is true that Trump has already quickly imposed a 10% tariff on Chinese imports because of the fentanyl precursors. But what is interesting here is, I think, the moderate response from China that did retaliate but did not go all out. And to me, that signifies that the Chinese are leaving open the possibility of engaging in a negotiation. And I understand perfectly well why they're doing this, because the more they entertain that negotiation, even if it doesn't achieve a sustainable equilibrium, a final outcome that facilitates an easier relation between the two great powers, they're running the clock on the Trump administration, and they're avoiding the hardcore competition. So I think that we might have an initial push for a deal, and but I don't believe that this deal can de facto change where there are structural factors that drive these towards a more competitive dynamic. Now, which one is better for Japan and for other countries, to have a climate of strong U.S.-China competition, or have a situation where there's some kind of rapprochement? I would say that in each scenario, there are opportunities and challenges. One, it's true, we've seen in the past that when U.S.-China relations are tense, that Beijing tries to be more conciliatory vis-a-vis Japan. And also, the Shiba administration more recently has been trying to stabilize Japan-China relations, and we've seen an uptick in diplomatic exchanges. So I think that that would create an opportunity to pursue that option. But China is doing that, but it's not easing its pressure on the Senkaku. It's not easing its pressure on Japan and many other fronts either. And in this climate of, if the scenario is one of strong U.S.-China competition, there are also risks for Japan, because we don't know if this competition will be handled responsibly. We don't know if we can avoid the worst case scenario, or if the United States, if say Trump becomes completely disenchanted with his negotiations and you have a move towards further decoupling, well, that also puts Japanese companies in a tough spot. So even that scenario has its also risks, of course. And finally, just very briefly, if the U.S. and China move towards a friendlier climate, again, whether this is good or bad for Japan depends on what brought about this rapprochement. If you have some really responsible, pragmatic, wise diplomacy sort of moderating this competition and putting in a more stable track, that's certainly good for Japan. But if this friendlier rapprochement comes from the U.S. weakening its own deterrence by sending signals about Taiwan that could create more instability, by withdrawing troops from ally South Korea, those are actions that will actually undermine severely Japan's own security. So it really depends on what's driving that potential scenario.
Thank you, Mireya. Jerry?
Well, I think these comments we've just heard are right on hit the nail on the head. But I would just say this: Trump may and Xi Jinping may work out a deal that would reduce the the tensions over trade relations. But the Trump administration's view, and it's not only the Trump administration for that matter, the American view that China poses the greatest external threat to the U.S. and needs to be contained, it's not going to change. I think that will be a constant during this regime, especially with the likes of China hawks in key positions. Rubio, Secretary of State, Waltz, the head of the National Security Council, the nomination of Super China hawk Eldridge Colby as Undersecretary of State for Policy, and a very vocal anti-China lobby among Republicans in Congress and amongst a good number of Democrats as well. We face a long period of what Mireya refers to as U.S.-China competition, and it can be the edges may be softened for a time. It can get very nasty for a time, but that fundamental structural feature of the world system, that is that the major competition is between the U.S. and China, I can't imagine that that's going to change. Now, the thing about the U.S., China, Japan relationship is that's important to think about, is that Japan might well find itself blindsided by sudden changes in U.S. policy towards China, including its commitment to Taiwan, which was the point that Taka, you mentioned. One in the audience asked a question about. We don't know, but the fact that Trump has been so solicitous of Putin and giving him concessions on a Ukrainian settlement before it's even negotiated and asked for, it has to send a message to Xi Jinping that maybe we can something similar can happen with regard to Taiwan, and we don't know what Trump's view is of Taiwan. Is he going to send American troops to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack? Well, maybe, but we don't know. Even more, there's no reason to believe that Trump is going to consult with Japan or any other country before making dramatic changes in policy, whether towards China, towards North Korea, or towards Russia. So Japan is in a situation where you're kind of moving forward, kind of blindfolded, because you don't know what your key allies' policies and strategies are going to be. And it just gets me back to the point I wanted to stress today. When Prime Minister Abe was Prime Minister, Japan had a strategic thinker in the Kante. He thought strategically, and he had a clear strategy for Japanese foreign policy. I don't think you can say the same for Prime Minister Ishiba or for any of the other leading political leaders that we see today. Although maybe it just hasn't had a chance to come to the fore. But there's no question Japan needs leaders who think strategically about how to respond to a new geopolitical situation, and that will, and it's in that context that you have to think about Japan-China relations.
Right, Kazuto.
Right, I think Mireya and Jerry has already mentioned and covered a lot of issues. I think from a Japanese point of view, this uncertainty of Trump is creating a lot of concerns of the difficulties of making a strategy, because of this is action-reaction relationship, and any sudden move of Trump, perhaps without consultation with Japan, could easily change the whole course of dynamics. So I think it is extremely difficult to put Japan into this bilateral relationship. And therefore, because this unpredictable situation of what Trump will do against China, it is very difficult from a Japanese point of view to where to deal, where we should put ourselves in. So instead of looking at the United States and reaction of Trump, I think Japan needs to develop its own strategy or the way to deal with this situation. On the one hand, Japan depends heavily on China in terms of economy, and we cannot just divest divest from China immediately. So I think what Japan needs to do is to make sure that we are not over dependent on China, and try to diversify our supply chain. On the other hand, there are certain concerns of the overcapacity. China is overproducing the goods beyond its demand, and therefore there are lots of Chinese goods were sold in discount prices. This is a typical dumping cases, and that will have a significant industrial impact. And I think this is somewhere Japan and the United States can work together. So I think probably what Japan needs to do in this context is that whether United States play confrontational or friendlier relationship with China, Japan needs to identify the items or the areas where we can cooperate with the United States, sharing the same interest with the United States, and what kind of actions that needs to be taken. No matter how much Mr. Trump wants to have a friendlier relationship with China, this fundamental economic relationship will not change. So I think this sort of not try to be tactical and nice, but to try to see the substantial importance of the Japan-U.S. alliance in vis-a-vis China. And of course, that also includes the importance of Taiwan. And what Japan needs to demonstrate and convince the Trump administration is the importance of Taiwan as the geopolitical strategic positioning. I mean, in terms of the preventing the Chinese Navy to come across the Taiwan Strait and coming to the Pacific Ocean, that will also have a significant impact on the strategic positioning. And since in the recent days, China has made an agreement with the Cook Islands, which were supposedly very having a strong tie with New Zealand, but China is expanding its influence in the South Pacific islands. So these are also nothing positive about a relationship between the United States and China. And I think these are the kind of things that Japan, United States, and possibly together with Australia and New Zealand, to work together to find out the right balance between the United States and China, and try to be more strategically, to be more strategic to construct this bilateral relationship, or in the much more wider context.
Thank you. One of the audience members asked the question, which I think we already answered, is would you mind sharing your insights on how the peace agreement between Russia and US might impact on the relationship between Europe and China, and also how it could further influence Japan's strategic choices? And we didn't talk about Europe and China. I think that's out of our scope today. And so let's move on to the next question, which may become the last question. So we have already talked about, Jerry emphasized the importance of strategic thinking in Prime Minister's office. And Kazuto also emphasized the Japan has to be prepared for any situation it might happen. And Mireya is also making similar points. But can we expect that in the minority government of the Prime Minister Ishiba, he has to spend a lot of time to stay in the power and push through the budget, next year's budget, and so on. The domestic agenda are so full, and maybe it seems, from outside that he doesn't have much strategic thinking or time to prepare for the strategic thinking of various scenarios of what if, Trump does this and that. So let's try to get some your insights on what is going on in the Japanese political situation, basically minority government, and their ability to negotiate or counter the changes in the Trump policies toward Japan. Let's go from Jerry and followed by Kazuto in the Mireya last. Jerry?
Well, I know we're just about out of time, so I'll keep it brief. But it goes without saying, this is a time when Japan really needs strong leadership, and it's not likely to have strong leadership for some time to come, whether Ishiba stays or is replaced. If the Ishiba-led minority government fails, well, it might be replaced by another LDP minority government, or by a fragile opposition party coalition, or by an LDP opposition party coalition. But these will be inherently weak governments. And we may face a situation like in the early 2000s with a new prime minister every year. When you have that, you don't have the ability to have strategic thinking and getting important things done. The pressure, the external pressure coming from the international community on Japan to sort of figure out what it's going to do to deal with this world situation is very strong. But the pressure coming from Japanese public is, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do about raising the ceiling on tax-exempt income? What are you going to do about making high school education tuition-free for all students? What are you going to do so that you don't make me pay higher taxes for a bigger defense budget? These are the issues that politicians have to respond to when they go to the polls, whether for the upper house election that's coming in the summer or for the next lower house election, which may come maybe even at the same time. So I'm not curious. I'm not pessimistic about Japan. Japan has a way to muddle through and to figure out how to manage things. But this is a particularly difficult period of time. Unfortunately, I don't see anything in the tea leaves that would suggest that there's a strong leader with a lot of public support and a strong party behind him that's going to move Japan through this period. But that's the challenge for Japan, to come up to recognize what the issues are that Japan has to deal with, what the most serious issues are, and to have leaders who have the courage to tell the public what you have to do in order to deal with them effectively.
Thank you. Kazuto?
Right. Thank you very much. I think Jerry has covered a lot of ground. But so far, I think Mr. Shiba has been doing better, or at least he's not making too much of a problem as the minority government. He made a lot of concession to DPP, the Kokumin Minshito, and Ishin. But I think so far, there are not much of resistance from the inside LDP to bring the Ishiba down. So far, I think Ishiba is on the balance between the minority oppositions, particularly the Kokumin Minshu and Ishin, and also the sort of the resistance forces in the LDP. I do agree with Jerry that because of the lack of because of the weakness in the domestic situation, it's very difficult to bring the strong leadership, and I think we need a strong leadership in this very circumstances, especially with regard to the Trump administration and conduct of the Japanese foreign and security policy. So I think the next election in summer will create certain opportunities for the reshuffle of the party, and together with the upper house and the lower house simultaneous election. Or otherwise, it's going to be Japan remains to be a weak leadership, but still, hanging on to a balance so that, it's not as terrible as other countries such as Germany or France, where, I think this is most of the major democracies now facing a very difficult time to set very strong leadership. So Japan is not the exception, but I think it's time that the strong leader creating the force to gather the forces of democracy and to make sure that we are led by the to the right direction. But I think so far, comparing to the European countries, Japan is, even though it's still unstable situation, Japan is still have certain stability. So I think we need to take that into account and make sure that at least give the leaders a chance to balance it out and to focus on the domestic issues. Meanwhile, give more free hand for the foreign and security policy.
Okay, thank you. Mireya, just 1 minute, please.
1 minute. I'll try to end with a little bit of an optimistic note. I agree that the domestic politics are very challenging, and certainly a return to this period of turnover of prime ministers, one prime minister a year, would be very, very disadvantageous for Japan. But I still think that this is happening. If this comes to pass, Japan has actually, in the meantime, built a lot of diplomatic heft, has built a lot of networks. And I think that those connections that Japan has established through security partnerships, through trade agreements, through economic assistance might actually provide an asset that was not there before Japan had engaged in this a more proactive foreign policy. Point number one. Another one, I think, and this ties also with Kazuto's point on stability. Japan still is not a highly polarized society or the politics, and this means that even if there is, the domestic politics are not as functional as they should be, you do not have, wide fluctuations, so that you go from a government that is, very proactive in diplomacy to one that's inward looking, right? I think that there's a lot of widespread consensus in Japan about the benefits of retaining this proactive foreign policy of the past. So I think that those might be things that might be helpful. Modeling through is not enough, and certainly retooling these diplomatic, these networks that Japan has established to take account of the new geopolitics and the new economics is going to be imperative. But I do believe that Japan is not as divided as other democracies, and that may provide a ray of hope.
Thank you very much. I will end with that positive note. And unfortunately, time is running out. So I would like to give a special thanks to Jerry, Mireya, and Kazuto for insightful contributions to today's discussion. And Takeo, do you want to add something as a final notes?
No, we are running out of time, but thank you all for a very sobering but insightful discussion.
Thank you. And I'd like to also reiterate our gratitude to the webinar's organizer, Tokyo College of the University of Tokyo, and co-sponsor the Center on Japanese Economy and Business at the Columbia Business School. Okay, thank you very much. And this is the end of the webinar.